The Differently Brained team acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we record, edit, and stream this podcast. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples and their elders past, present, and future. We extend our respect to all First Nations cultures and recognise their ongoing connection to the lands, waterways, and communities.
Just a reminder that Differently Brained shares conversations about mental health and neurodivergence. Sometimes these topics can get a bit heavy, so please remember to check in with yourself before listening. And as always, please reach out for help if our chats have brought anything up for you. Now, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome to Differently Brained, the podcast where no brain is the same. As always, I'm Jacinta Dietrich.
And as semi-regularly, I am Lachlan Rutherford. And we are here today with another guest, as per usual. We're talking today to Jess Horn. Jess is an Australian children's author who's passionate about empowering kids and sparking imagination. Her stories are full of humour and heart, often exploring the world from a neurodivergent perspective. With a background in speech pathology and disability services, she now pursues her love of words by weaving stories with a subtle message of inclusivity, encouraging readers to think outside the box. She lives with her rainbow family of 4 in Sydney, and her debut picture book, Bernie Thinks in Boxes, is out now with a firm press. Jess, thank you so much for coming onto our show today.
No worries, thanks for having me.
So, the question that is always asked at the beginning is, What is your identity that brings you to our show today?
I guess my identity would be that I'm an autistic ADHDer or an AudHDer or an autistic person with ADHD. I can't land on a label really because ADHD kind of bugs me because it's not really an adjective. But yeah, one of those will do.
Yeah.
I think I've had plenty of labels over the years which have probably been on and off fairly accurate in describing the side effects of being an autistic ADHD brain trying to get by in life, but not really the whole situation. And that sort of left me trying to fix things that were just a part of me. So, yeah.
I absolutely love that you have a gripe with ADHD because it's not an adjective, because the same thing happens to me all the time. And I've only just started coming around to, referring to myself as an ADHD kind of thing because, I love identity first language and, I go with autistic. But as a writer, I'm always like, but that's ADHD. That's not it.
Yeah.
That's not.
Well, I think that we can probably mold language to suit ourselves. I think language changes over time, and I think we can totally claim ADHD as a word. I think that's a word. Let's make it a word.
Good.
Why
it's
not?
a word now. Speaking of, I think I know the answer based on, how you answered the previous one, but do you go with person first or identity first language? I assume you're identity first.
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who was trained as an allied health professional 15 years ago, it's been hard to shift to identity first, I guess, because we were sort of taught to say person with a disability and that was respectful back then. But now I do identify with identity first language. I think that makes the most sense because it's about sort of owning autism as a part of yourself rather than something that could be removed from me as a person. And also I think person first language probably leaves us sort of more open to the belief that autism is something that could be cured or changed rather than just a type of brain. So that's kind of my reasoning behind making that shift.
Yeah. I mean, I don't go with identity first for my diagnosis. I've got bipolar disorder and OCD, which, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, that is a neurodivergence, but it's something that I think probably needs to be treated as opposed to autism, which is, it's a neurodivergence and it's not really something that has to be, treated with
fixed or cured or.
Yeah. I think it's really tricky, like a tricky line to draw, because I think even prior to being diagnosed as autistic, I, had many labels, one of which was, anxiety in its various forms. And I think part of me was always just well, am I just an anxious person? Because I went through years of doing, CBT or whatever it is they do. And ultimately, yes, I think it is useful to some extent. But then also for me, I was well, I think this is just how I am.
Yeah.
This is just me as a person. And so I think that anxiety as a symptom could be worked on and improved, but also I had to acknowledge that I think you can also just be an anxious type of person. So I think it's like hard to draw a line, and I guess it's just about trying to do what you need to do to make your life the best it can be, whether that's trying to fix something or trying to accept something. I think it just depends on the individual and the thing that you're working with.
Yeah, definitely.
I love that answer. Yeah, I think there's so many layers to it, and it's still some ways from being publicly understood as something layered and things like that. But, you know, with more representation, more conversations, all of that, I think things are slowly getting better. But yes.
Yeah, I think I'm still very much learning along the way as well. I definitely think there's much more that we can learn as a community, and I can learn as an individual.
I mean, even us on this show, like, we're learning so much with every single episode that we do, talking to people. It's definitely not meant to be set up as arbiters of wisdom or whatever. We're just as much learning as everyone else.
So what does your autistic ADHD self look like? I know, you know, I personally see it as more of like a pie chart where some of us have different bits and pieces kind of thing that are, you know, strengths and areas. What's it look like for you? How did you figure it out?
I think the very initial thing that clued me into the autism side of things is probably just my need for sticking to routines. And I distinctly remember a scenario that kind of got me thinking about it was I have a lot of routines and rules around food. And like logically, I know I don't have to stick to them, but also it really bothers me if I don't. So for example, at the time that this occurred, I'd had a routine where I'd have like a chocolate biscuit after dinner in the evening with a cup of tea or whatever it was. And that was my thing that I was doing at that time. And I remember my family, like my kids wanted to go out and get ice cream. And I was like, I really wanted to be spontaneous and go and get the ice cream. And I wanted to enjoy that. And I went. But by the time we got home, I was cranky and stressed because I didn't actually want the ice cream because I felt that the ice cream would interfere with my biscuit routine, because then I was like, well, I've had dessert. Can I have another dessert? And it really mucked me up. And I think it's just like that sort of stuff that was commonly happening that made me think, hey, is there something more to this? I guess aside from the routine side of things, like my head's just very busy, which I didn't know wasn't a thing like that everyone had. But like it's just constantly thinking, snowballing, to-do lists, but also feeling like everything's just constantly swimming around in there like a giant fish tank, but I can't actually grab anything because it's too slippery. So it's like hard to pinpoint things that I'm trying to think about or understand as well. So I feel like everything just feels big and overwhelming sometimes. I think that's me in a nutshell. Yeah.
And it was those recognitions that made you then take the leap into getting a formal diagnosis?
Yeah, well, I think a few interesting things happened that around the same time that sort of led to that, which, you know, maybe it was the universe sending me a message, I don't know. But so as I was starting to think about this stuff, then not long after that, my son's daycare said, hey, we think, you know, maybe you should look into autism for your son. And I was like, oh, okay, that's news to me. Also, about a week after that, my auntie randomly sat me down and said, oh, hey, I've been diagnosed with autism. And I was like, I had absolutely no idea that this was a possibility. I was very surprised. And then I was immediately quite teary, I think, because I was like, oh, I'd sort of been thinking this, but I didn't actually know it could be true because it wasn't my experience of what autism had to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read your blog post on, I think it was Aspect, and you were talking about how you'd mentioned offhand, like, oh, I'm probably on the spectrum kind of thing, but because people didn't confirm that really for you, it was kind of something that felt a little maybe not true. Like I can definitely relate to that, where I think that was a similar pathway to me, where it was always kind of like we've all developed past this, but like it was kind of like a joke in my family, like, oh, I'm the Sheldon Cooper one, I'm the autistic one kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was like really minor base level things, like I'm not really touchy-feely kind of thing. And so then when I'd look at characters like that, I was like, oh, I don't think that is me. And it was just kind of like a weird side joke that never really fully got traction, but was still constantly there.
Yeah.
And I found it, really interesting how you talked about that kind of similar stuff and how you maybe didn't have the confidence for self-diagnosis versus formal diagnosis.
Yeah. I think when I sort of look at my family on the whole, it's probably not hugely surprising that I didn't feel like a real odd one out
Yeah.
within my family. Not naming anyone in particular who doesn't want a diagnosis, but I think, in terms of having brought it up earlier in my life, it was at a time when, well, there was a very different picture of what autism was. Even like the diagnostic criteria were different.
Yeah.
And it's not something that would have been identified even if I had been saying that at the time. So I do remember a time when I said to the psychologist I was speaking to back in my early 20s, like, for context, I'm now 37, sort of saying, hey, I remember jokingly mentioning, oh, I must be on the spectrum, and I remember her going, really clearly going, oh, really? And then I went, oh, no, like, shut it down, because I felt so embarrassed that I might have suggested something that they would think was stupid. And that was the end of that. It never got brought up again. So I think it just goes to show how far we've come, how far health professionals have come, some of them, hopefully, in terms of, identifying this stuff as well. Yeah, so I think I got off the track there. I can't remember what we're talking about, but yeah, I can blame my brain for that one, I guess.
Not a problem at all. Yeah, we get off track all the time. We accidentally lead our guests off track. It happens.
It's a good place to be, off the track. Sometimes you can find exciting things that way.
Absolutely. How did you manage that, I guess, imposter syndrome as you were, going through trying to figure things out for yourself and then formal diagnosis? And then even still after having the piece of paper, I know, I think we both share a similar experience of even when you've got the tick, you're still like, oh, but what if I was faking? What if I just tricked them? What if I'm a silly, cheeky girl? How did you manage that imposter syndrome and then reach more of a level of self-acceptance where you write about being neurodivergent and unmasking and things like that?
It's tricky. And I think it's always easier for me to write things than it is to be present in the moment, like face to face. So writing about things is my comfort zone. And so that's much easier. If I meet someone and disclose, oh, hey, I'm autistic, which, to be honest, I don't usually do, except that now I'm on a podcast doing it. It's hard because I do still go, oh, like if they doubt me, then it just fills me with self-doubt again. Like it's really hard to get past that.
Yeah.
It's ongoing. It's like one day I'll be like, yeah, heck yes, I'm autistic. I can totally see this. I feel good about that. And then the next day I'll be doubting myself. I'm pretty black and white. So as you said, Jacinta, it's like, even though I had the tick of approval, I had a letter from a psychiatrist saying, yes, you're autistic. I found it hard to believe because I'm like, but what if she did it wrong? But what if I said something wrong? And because there's no like blood test, there's no like scan that will clearly show it for sure. Even though logically I know it's a real thing, it's still invisible. And I find that hard. And that's probably like the very black and white thinking coming in there. I know that in terms of moving past this, being able to recognize things that I do and why I do them with that sort of autism lens has helped me to be a bit more accepting of myself and patient with myself. And being able to do that and recognize those things, it does help with acceptance a little bit, I guess. Because I think I came from a very sort of get up and get on with it mindset initially. So it's kind of like, okay, this has given me a bit more permission to understand and maybe be a bit more patient. And then also just reading lots of other people's experiences and seeing that there are other people out there who are like me and don't look like, inverted commas, someone with autism, as, stereotypes would have it. So, but it's still very much, I know you love the word, Lachlan, it's still very much a journey. I'm trying to work this out,
Sometimes it's the only word that fits. Really.
I know. I think I listened to an episode yesterday where you said exactly that. And I'm like, I have to drop journey into this somewhere today.
That makes me so happy.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, this idea I'm putting out is by no means like a controversial or new or, I guess, salient idea, but it just seems like with you talking about not having sort of blood test results or any of that kind of stuff to quantify having a mental illness or neurodivergent brain, like it seems as though, I don't know, however many years of social conditioning that has led us to basically believe that quantifiable evidence is somehow more, I guess, important.
I think science, people just like science. Well, some people like science.
Yeah.
I guess, you're right. Like, I think as like a society, like we do often value things with clear evidence, although interestingly, as time goes on and we learn more things, even science can change. So, which is, kind of annoying, really, but true. So, yeah, but I mean, for me personally, like I have a very scientific sort of brain, and I'm like, well, it's either this or it's that. Like, I don't like gray area, and I think there's a downside to working like that, but
yeah, I think that what you were both saying, being able to like point to a thing and be like, look, here's the evidence, and have a hard line kind of, it feels very different to like, oh, I talked to a person and they said, yeah. I think it's hard as well for so many neurodivergent people because so many of us had to push for a diagnosis. So many of us have had to fight for it. So many of us have had to go in with so much research and lists and our own screening tools and questionnaires and things like that.
Having a list should be a diagnosis in itself. So. Like, I wrote a list about myself. Okay, yep, tick, you're autistic.
So I did actually ask my psychiatrist after I got, all of my things out of the way. And I was like, oh, were there any like early signs in our first few sessions kind of thing? Because mine was surprisingly quick diagnosis process. I was really, really lucky. And she literally said, yeah, dude, you came in with 4 pages of Microsoft Word. Am I autistic? Like, yeah, that was it. And I was like, oh, yeah, cool.
I did the same thing, and mine was also quite quick, and that was actually one of my issues. It's like, oh, she only talked to me for like an hour. I feel like this is very short compared to other people. So either I was like super duper autistic and it was really obvious, or I don't know. I was always doubtful, like about, oh, she didn't spend enough time. Maybe it was just really clear. Who knows? But I did take a list. It was a table. I think it was about 4 pages too. And I had it categorized in roughly into the DSM, like diagnostic criteria. But I didn't call it that because I was trying really hard to not look like I was being an expert.
Yeah.
So I dumbed it down a little bit by saying, behaviory type things or like stuff like that. Cause I just had this such fear of like going in and being like, look, I've self-diagnosed. Like, I'm always quite worried, I guess, about, because these people are like experts and professionals, and there is a hierarchy, and I think I find it hard to not be the very tiny person in that situation, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. But by the time most of us go in for a diagnosis, we are an expert at that point because we've deep dived and we've made the list, and, it's our lived experience and stuff. And it's, really difficult finding that balance of going in and, like you said, not wanting to appear overboard kind of thing so that they're like, oh, well, you're just fishing for a diagnosis. You're just fishing for something, but then also trying to show like, hey, look, no, I'm pretty confident at this point. Look at all the things. I think it's really difficult for our community, and I don't know what the solution is, but I definitely relate to all of that.
The concept of fishing for a diagnosis is interesting as well, because if I think about it, what does anyone really get out of an autism diagnosis aside from, I mean, yes, there's definitely like for people who have, higher support needs, there's definitely support out there. But for people who potentially don't want to seek support and, managing quite well day to day, but they just want a label, like they're just seeking to understand themselves better. So really, I don't think there's anything negative. As much as, fishing for a diagnosis has a negative sort of connotation, I think when you break it down, it's just people trying to understand themselves. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the understanding of autism and ADHD has changed within the scientific and larger communities to an extent. How about your own understanding of them? Have they changed over the years?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's quite interesting because I studied speech pathology and I started working as a speech pathologist in 2009, straight out of uni. And I was working in disability specifically. So a lot of the clients I was working with were autistic. Most of them had, quite significant, like complex disabilities and support needs. A lot of them were non-speaking, and the framework back then was quite different. So it was all about, sorting out their challenging behaviors and whatnot. So I kind of learned about autism in that sense. And ADHD wasn't even a thing on my professional radar at the time. It was more, that was more something I knew about from being a kid myself. So very much the stereotypical, naughty boy in the back of the class who won't sit still type of thing. So I guess that's where I came from. And then I kind of dipped out of the whole autism world because I moved on and got a different job, which is in injury management type stuff. And so I feel like I kind of drew a line there, and then I've come back into the world and had to sort of relearn it all and go, oh, actually, this is a whole new thing now. We have so much more information about it. It's something that I now can fit into. So I'm actually trying to relearn it, I guess. And it is so different to what I learnt, back when I was at uni. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a big shift.
No, that's really interesting. And I hadn't even thought about, of course, you'd learn about some parts in speech pathology and things like that, but I hadn't even clued together that you would have come from that kind of background and then also had your own personal situation. So you've got, pivoting a little bit,
yes,
you've got a new picture book out and they're already announced, so I'm not spoiling anything. A few more coming over the next few years. Oh my gosh, busy.
I know, I've managed to line up one per year, which is quite nice.
It's very impressive. I don't know how you did that, but I was like, bravo.
Yep. No, it was a few years behind the scenes rather, before I got there. But then I think I also just got a bit lucky. It's always about what pitching opportunities you can get at the time and meeting the right people with the right story at the right time. So it's a really hard gig trying to get a traditional publishing contract. And I've learned a whole load of things about picture books that I didn't know 5 years ago. But yes, I do have a book coming out. When this is aired, it will be out. Called Bernie Thinks in Boxes. It's about a girl called Bernie whose thoughts are organized into categories or boxes. And so she has a box for everything. So for school, for park, she's even got one for breakfast, lunch and dinner. And when she's invited to a friend's birthday party at the park, she's overwhelmed by the number of things outside of their correct boxes. You've got school kids who are not at school, or they're out of uniform, or, there's people in the park that she doesn't usually see there. So she finds that quite overwhelming. And in the end, she manages to find her own way to celebrate her friend's birthday, which is a little less out of the box for her. So, I started writing the story, interestingly, before I got my autism diagnosis. It actually took me about a year to finish. And then by the time I got my diagnosis, I was able to unpack some of that a bit more. I actually managed to finally get the ending of the story right. So, it took me that long and a bit of discovering my own story, I guess, to get this one sorted. So it's an interesting process.
I love the whole concept so much. And I think I haven't really thought about how I do compartmentalize things and separate them and things like that. But absolutely, the breakfast, lunch and dinner boxes, very relatable to me, where I can only eat certain foods at certain times. Otherwise, I get uncomfortable kind of thing. So there are
eggs are not a dinner food.
No. And I can have pancakes for dessert or breakfast, but they can't be any other meal kind of thing.
Exactly. That's spot on.
Soup is not a breakfast food. No. Can't do that. That's not okay. So it's just so nice to be I think it's one of those moments where, like you were saying about how you didn't realize that everybody didn't have a busy brain. It was a real light bulb moment where I was like, other people think in boxes. And it was just a really accessible way to be duh. Because I think, every time I try and explain how I compartmentalize thoughts and how I have different sections, it's always been really, really hard to articulate. But simply just being I think in boxes.
Yeah, it's just sort of an analogy that's developed. And I think it is about compartmentalizing and also about sort of associations, I think.
Yeah.
And part of that is about, routine and rules. And as you're saying about having, certain foods for breakfast versus dinner or whatever. But part of it's also about the way that you store information. And for me, we could be having a conversation yesterday about something, and then today you'll start talking to me about it, and I'll not know that we're talking about the same thing, because yesterday, I think I've used this analogy before, but yesterday you might have been talking to me about pears, and today you start talking to me about apples, and I don't know that I'm supposed to apply the information you told me yesterday about pears to apples because they're different fruits, but you think you're just talking about fruit. And so, do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so it's I kind of don't necessarily apply information from one situation or scenario to another. Same thing happens with like, if someone asks you a broad question, worst case scenario, like a job interview, which very much hate, never ever going to get a new job ever. They ask you like big broad questions, and you can have all the information packed into all these different boxes, and you've got the skills, you've got the information, but it's like, oh, which box do they want me to open?
Yeah.
Like, what are they actually asking for? Or they might be asking for things from a whole bunch of different boxes, but I can't pull those together because in my head they're categorized. So, yeah, I don't know. I have far too many analogies for box-like thinking, but hopefully that made some sort of sense.
The analogies are actually helpful for me, because I am not autistic, and I am able to understand what you're saying, that it might be so exhausting sometimes to be able to communicate with someone and then try to put all of those ideas together in some sort of way that is going to be understandable for that person. It's like, I've talked about this before on the show. It's like you're trying to be empathetic beyond the means that you were potentially able to in that point in time, just for the comfort of that other person that you're talking to. And in return, you just kind of like get tired and potentially flustered.
Yeah. And also you just end up annoying the person who thinks that you're supposed to know what they're talking about because they already told you another time, but you don't know that they're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
So it can result in frustration as well for your communication partner, as well as, being draining, for me.
Yeah. Just circling back really quickly, the thing that I found really interesting was what you said in regards to your own journey and then coming to the understanding of how to finish the book itself. I find that such an interesting idea of writing something, of like having self-discovery being in tandem with how you're also doing the creativity. It's just, that's always so interesting to me.
Yeah, it was an interesting process and a bit of a light bulb moment, because I think when I was writing the story, I kind of had the misconception that the main character should conform to social expectations. So I was looking for ways to get her to manage to stay at the party and do the things and actually enjoy herself. And I was like, it wasn't until after my diagnosis and I started reflecting more on accommodations and that sort of thing and understanding that a bit more, that I was like, hang on, she doesn't actually have to do this, and she doesn't have to mask, and she doesn't have to force herself to enjoy something that she doesn't want to do. This is just a party. It's not life and death, and she can do this celebration in her own way, in her own time. So yeah, picture books are 500 words, max usually. It doesn't seem like a great feat to write one, but my goodness, a year later, I finally got there.
Yeah.
Well, I had a question about that actually, because I think, like you just said, because they are shorter in word count, I guess, I think there is such this assumption that like, oh, you just spit one out.
Yeah.
Can you explain why it takes a year to write, why it actually is so much harder than what everybody thinks it is? Because I keep giving it a crack and I can't get it. I can't at all.
Well, look, before I actually did some courses and learnt more about it, I was like, yeah, picture book, you just jot down some words. I had to learn about character development, about narrative structure, about all the different sort of language techniques that work well in picture books. I had to learn about how many page spreads. I had to learn about how to work with illustrations. So, for example, not saying everything that's going to also be shown in the picture. There's so much involved in them, and you have to do it. You have to pack a full narrative and character development and everything within a very small number of words. And so it is about really being very clear and concise, and also choosing your words very carefully. And yeah, like you can just whack down a picture book, and sometimes the first draft will come, I'll sit down in like half an hour and just jot something down. It's never going to be the finished version. Like a lot of these things have many, many, many drafts. And then, you finally get a publishing contract and they'll be like, hey, can you rewrite this entirely? So actually Bernie Thinks in Boxes pretty much is how I submitted it. It didn't really get rewritten. But my next two contracts after that, I rewrote them after the contract, and I'm happy. They're much better. But I guess it just goes to show how much is in writing a picture book. And sorry, I'm rambling, but also it's also the gatekeepers, and it's not just about writing a good story. It's about being able to pitch it. It's about being what people want at the time
Yeah.
what's already on the market. Have you found a gap to fill? Is this what the publisher's looking for? So there's so much more to getting published than just writing a good story as well.
Yeah, as much as we'd love to, always think of publishing as an arts endeavor and for the love of all of it and stuff, it is still a commercial industry that, needs to sell to keep the wheels turning, I guess. And so, it is really hard when you've got something brilliant, but they've already got something like that in the list, or there's just not the market for it. So I'm so bloody glad that you found publishers.
Yeah.
I know. I'm so happy. Yeah. And when I look at the 3 that I've signed so far, I can see that they do have something a bit unique or a bit special. And whereas I've got a whole pile of other stories that I've written, which are also good stories, I can see that these ones are just a little bit out of the box, if I may say. So I think that's what got them across the line. Yeah.
I love that so much. So much. How important is representation in books for you in terms of, autistic ADHDers and things? Were there things that you saw growing up when you were reading and watching things? Or is it something that you really, really didn't see and that's part of why you wanted to put Bernie and your other books out into the world?
I think when I was growing up, there wasn't much diversity in books. And what there was always there was a real negative focus on it. So if there was someone with a difference or a disability or something in some way, it was always that was a kid that got picked on, or that was made the focal point of the story. Mm-hmm. I think that children's literature, I think it's really important that it reflects the diversity that kids see within their peer groups. And I think it should be about normalizing all the ways of being. That doesn't necessarily make the disability or the neurotype stand out as being different or the odd one out or the focal point of the story. So I think there's definitely a place for, nonfiction kids books that talk explicitly about, this is what autism is, this is what ADHD is, so that kids can learn and understand what those labels are. Mm-hmm. But I think equally as important, we need to be showing diversity through authentic characters who are just there, just having their own experience, rather than being the odd one out in the story, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think the choices that the neurodivergent characters make in these stories is really important in modelling a neurodivergence affirming approach. So, for example, in Bernie Thinks in Boxes, as I mentioned before, she could have forced herself to mask and endure the discomfort of being at a social event, but instead, she chooses to prioritize her own needs above social conformity. And and the outcome is still wonderful. It's just different. And I guess that's an important message that we can send with neurodivergent characters making these sorts of choices.
Yeah, the sort of narrative that exists predominantly, well, maybe it's changing now, or I think it probably is, but previously it was the conformity narrative. Grease, for example. I know it's not the best example, but it's the first one that comes to mind. That is a conformity narrative. And it seems to be the acceptable cultural thing of changing your ways in order to fit in. And there have been a slew of books and other media in recent times that have been challenging that and being no, it's okay to actually be yourself,
Yeah, I think that's the most important message. Yeah. And in my book, Bernie is not actually labelled as being autistic,
right?
Which I think that there are different schools of thought on. And I had at the time gone, oh, should she be labelled? Shouldn't she be labelled? And ultimately, in discussions with the publisher, they sort of made that call. And I was happy with the decision to not label her, because that's how I wrote the story originally, because I wasn't diagnosed.
Yeah.
And I think I thought a lot about this, and I'm oh, is this a bad thing that she's not labeled and representing autism and that sort of thing? But I think, no, I think there's definitely a place for labels, and I think labels are great and there's nothing bad about having them. But also I think there's something really valuable in just having a kid who's having an experience that may or may not be relatable to the reader, may or may not have a label that matches the reader, but it's just showing that there's different ways of thinking regardless of what brain type you have as well. So I think it's it reaches a bit of a broader audience in that sense.
Yes.
But I think having a mix of books on the market with labels and no labels works well.
It also dives into the idea of picture books being kind of inherently interactive for kids. If they're being read the story by a carer or something, and then there is the prompts with pictures to be able to talk about what's going on and all that kind of stuff, it means that questions could be brought up as they're reading the book, saying, do you feel like this kind of thing? from time to time, rather than just saying this is a prescription of what you are.
Yeah, that's right. And like, who's to say that somebody who doesn't, meet the diagnostic criteria for autism wouldn't have this experience as well? Like,
Exactly.
No, it's just so beautiful, and I love the way that you speak about it. You clearly love this book so much, and I'm sure readers are going to love it as much as you do, because you've put so much into it, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. It's just, I can't wait to see it, and I think
I know, me too. Can't wait. Just hold the thing. It's going to be exciting.
Aside from your fantastic, spectacular Bernie Thinks in Boxes and the other books that are forthcoming, what are some other representations that you think have been done particularly well around, autistic characters or ADHD characters or unlabeled but you feel the vibes kind of characters across like any media, books, films, music, whatever you want, games?
I think I know you guys have had a couple of episodes on Heartbreak High, and I think Chloe's character, what's her name? Can't even think of her name. Quinny, that's the one. I think Quinny's great, and I do really relate to some things about her, but also she's like so full of this energy that I just don't feel that I have. I do think that's a great character. The character who I most relate to, and I just love everything about, is actually Nicholas, played by Josh Thomas in Everything's Gonna Be Okay.
Yeah.
Have you seen that series?
I still haven't watched it. I really need to, because I absolutely adored Please Don't Like Me.
Me too, and I liked this one better. So.
Oh, okay.
I mean, look, his character is pretty much just him, so like it's not really a character. But I just have always really related to the way he presents, and his character in this show eventually, like he's an ADHDer who eventually, sorry, spoiler alert, gets diagnosed as autistic in the second season. So I just really relate to his character. I don't think I'm as like funny or outgoing as him, which would be nice. But I just relate to the way he experiences his relationships and the communication breakdowns that happen for him. I find that really real. So that's my major one that I like.
Excellent.
Those are brilliant and wonderful. Jess, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us. It's been just absolutely so delightful. You are just such a bubbly, warm, wonderful human being. I'm so happy that we've actually been able to talk and hear each other's voices, because we've chatted online a little bit, but to actually hear you, and I'm just so excited for the books. I hope they find their way into so many homes. I know that it's definitely going to be one that I'm giving to every kid in my life, just popping it out everywhere. For anyone who wants to learn more about Jess and the things that we've spoken about today, I will put things in the show notes. I have dedicated podcast days and hours now, so show notes are coming back, I promise. They will be there. Go and get the book. Go and check us out. We do things, not very interesting things, but...
Hey,
yeah. That is a fib.
But it was just so lovely. Thank you so much. And we'll see you guys all next week, I guess.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, any resources that we discussed in this episode will be linked in our show notes. Do you want to hang out with us in our lovely growing online community? Well, then join us in our Facebook group. We share our stories, resources, memes. It's basically just a nice and fun place to be. You can also check out our Instagram at Differently Brained Podcast, as well as mine and Jacinta's own personal accounts. All of our episodes are available to download and listen to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you find your podcasts.
Differently Brained shares the opinions of individuals and does not consider your personal circumstances. Differently Brained exists purely for information purposes and should not be relied on as health or medical advice. Because no brain is the same, please consult your healthcare professional for your personal medical needs.